Okay, hello everyone, welcome. Good morning to those of you in Europe, good evening to those of you across Australia and the Asia Pacific, and good whatever other time of day it is to those joining us, or good very middle of the night to people joining us from the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion about Royal Dutch Shell's ability to meet its climate targets. So my name is Bryn O'Brien. I am the Executive Director of ACCR, the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, and it's my absolute pleasure to be your moderator this evening. The ACCR is a shareholder advocacy and research organisation based in Australia, and we've recently started coverage of global stocks. But before I explain a little bit about our global program, I just want to acknowledge, as is customary and very important for those of us joining you from the continent of Australia, that I am joining you from the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples of the Eora Nation, the lands of these First Nations peoples that was never ceded. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people joining us on this call today. So as I said, it's my absolute pleasure to launch this new research group with this webinar this evening, Global Climate Insights. In ACCR's engagement with global institutional investors, many have expressed the desire to understand the implications of corporate climate strategies, and in particular since the emergence of the Say On Climate Initiative, company transition plans as they're being put to a vote of shareholders in a timely, actionable and meaningful way. This demand again has become even more acute since the emergence of the Say On Climate company transition plan votes. So Global Climate Insights is a response to that demand. It is seeking to address this gap in the market to help investors, major shareholders in these companies, assess the credibility of these plans that are being put to shareholders for a vote. So I will be your moderator for this evening. We have an esteemed, an extraordinary group of panellists that I'm so delighted to introduce. In the first 30 minutes of this presentation, you will hear from Ling Liauw, ACCR and Global Climate Insights lead analyst, who comes to us with 15 years of experience in equities analysis across firms like Commonwealth Bank of Australia and UBS. It's really an absolute delight to work with and learn from Ling, who's certainly been putting a lot of hard work into this Shell note. We will be joined also by Dr. Simon Lewis, who is a professor at the Global Change Science at the University College of London and University of Leeds, author of the book The Human Planet. Professor Lewis's research intersects with several highly relevant policy areas to this discussion, including tropical forests, deforestation and degradation, climate change and biodiversity. And Professor Lewis, or Simon, as I'll call you from here on in, thank you so much for joining us. We'll also hear from Dr. and Associate Professor Malte Meinshausen, Professor at the University of Melbourne and one of the lead authors of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Interesting fact, Malte was named as number 45 in the world's 1,000 most influential climate scientists by Reuters. So he will be speaking on our remaining carbon budget. He's an expert, of course, in carbon budgets, climate and climate scenarios. So that conversation will go for about 30 minutes. We'll then have a panel discussion and audience Q&A. We do hope to get plenty of time to have the Q&A. Some minor housekeeping. Please be aware that the first 30 minutes of this presentation is being recorded. The panel discussion won't be, but we do ask that you observe the Chatham House rule. You've been muted, your video is disabled, but we do encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A section. Our speakers will endeavour to to address as many of them as possible in the time available. And we really do thank you all for your attendance and participation. We hope it's a very lively conversation. So I'll now hand over to Ling Liauw, the Global Climate Insights lead analyst, to present the findings of our research on Royal Dutch Shell's climate transition plan.
Thank you very much, Bryn, and thanks everybody for coming today. Today we're going to share with you some of our key findings from our two-part in-depth report on Shell's climate transition plan that's due to be released at the end of October. Before I get into the detail, I just wanted to share a little bit about our team. So Global Climate Insights, as Bryn mentioned, is a new research team of ACCRs focused on climate transition plan. At the heart of what we want to do is to bring the same level of rigour and testing as there currently is in the market for earnings forecasts to climate transition. We've got a team of analysts with equities research experience within the oil and gas sector and on climate. The work we're going to share with you today is on Shell's climate transition plan. And the key thing we have done is to take Shell's Powering Progress strategy and its aspirations for market share and understand what that might mean for absolute emissions. And the reason why we've had this task is because Shell doesn't have an absolute emission reduction target. So all its emission reduction targets are intensity based. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. An important part of our research is clarity. So I wanted just to share with you some of the common terms you might see in our presentation today. So absolute emissions we use to describe all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is typically quoted as an annual number. Net emissions we use to describe absolute emissions, but including post-emission compensation tools such as carbon capture and storage and offsets. You'll hear this quite commonly in relation to net zero targets. So let's start the story with a bit of scene setting. This chart shows the emissions that Shell currently discloses. So it includes Scope 1 emissions from their operations, Scope 2 emissions from the energy that they purchase, Scope 3 emissions from their value chain, which includes inputs, as well as the further processing of their products, the distribution and the use of products sold. Pleasingly, Shell discloses Scope 3 for their own production and also for third-party products and includes that in their target. However, like any corporate, we also need to understand what emissions they're not disclosing versus their business. For Shell, the most material are in relation to their chemical Scope 3 emissions and also their trading business. Now, the emissions that Shell disclose is over these 5 years. And if we look at this, I guess the first thing that stood out to us was the quantum of emissions that we're dealing with. So even in 2020, Shell's emissions were 1.4 gigatons, which is greater than the size of the emissions of Japan. As we know, though, emissions that sit within our atmosphere, they aren't just there for 1 or 5 years at a time. They are cumulative. So we wanted to understand what Shell's emission profile might look like over a longer period. So we used some production data from Shell and constructed a 30-year emission profile. We were expecting to see emissions most materially increasing over the last 5 years, with maybe the last 5 years representing a peak. But what we actually found was that over this 30-year timeframe, as you can see, the estimated emissions have exceeded every year 1 gigaton. If we take this even further and estimate Shell's emissions since inception, we came up with 116.5 gigatons. You can compare this to the global historical greenhouse gas emissions of 3,864 gigatons. And for many of you who've probably read the really sobering report from the IPCC this year, who told us that our historical greenhouse gas emissions have already contributed to irreversible climate impacts, Shell has contributed 3% to this. Today, we'll hear from Professor Meinshausen about the carbon budget, and he is also a co-author of the IPCC report. So in the last slides, we've established the significance of Shell's role in greenhouse gas emissions. And now we want to think about what that means going forward. Now, for oil and gas, they're at the heart of climate transition, but not all oil and gas companies will survive. The type of fuels we have today are going to look different tomorrow, and we're already seeing competition increasing and barriers to entry change. We believe investors need to understand which companies they're investing in have a strategy that is truly aligned with a decarbonised future. In particular, for oil and gas companies, we see 4 things as being really important. These are our red lines: urgent and absolute reduction of emissions in the next 10 years, alignment of emission reduction with a 1.5-degree pathway, measurable and actionable transition strategies, much like you would any other business case. It's really just good governance, and a vision to thrive in a zero carbon economy, i.e. your material growth cannot come from high emitting sectors. Okay, so that was the context. And now we're going to share a few of our findings today. It's all come from the market share aspirations of Shell. To understand what market sizes might look like by fuel, we've used Shell's own Sky 1.5-degree scenario. And where that hasn't got a fuel forecast, we've used the IEA net zero scenario. And we don't look at how difficult it may be for Shell to meet some of its market share aspirations. So we've been quite generous in that respect. So let's look at absolute emissions and what powering progress means for that. My favourite is always including a waterfall chart somewhere. Here we show absolute emissions from 2019 to 2030 under Shell's strategy. You can see the key change is in reduction is from oil. Shell has an aspiration to decrease its oil production 1% to 2% per annum. Within the numbers that we've put against Shell's strategy, we've assumed a 2% reduction. However, not even this is sufficient to compensate for its gas aspirations. Combining gas and LNG emissions will more than offset its decrease in oil. Also, if we look at net emissions on the right-hand side, we see that they will also exceed the 2019 emissions. The reduction from absolute emissions is primarily due to nature-based offsets. And Professor Lewis will speak more about the role of nature-based solutions in climate transition strategies for corporates later this evening. Turning this to Shell's targets, so all their targets are based on net carbon intensity. So that is for energy products, the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent for the energy delivered. Now, Shell are targeting a 62.9 net carbon intensity by 2030. On our numbers, they may just miss this gap, ex divestments. And you can see, again, the largest driver of this reduction is nature-based solutions. As part of the red lines that we described before, one of them was alignment with a 1.5-degree pathway. We've looked at the IEA net zero scenario, absolute emission reduction implied, and compared that to where we expect Shell to be. As you can see, by 2050, the IEA net zero scenario assumes a 73% reduction in absolute emissions versus a 7% increase that we've forecast for Shell, creating an 80% gap. And I'm sure it will be no surprise when we look at the requirements of the Hague District Court that came out in May for Shell to reduce its net emissions by 2030 by 45%, that Shell will miss this target. Not only that, it will miss it by 817 million tonnes, emissions the size of Germany. That's a lot to take in. Well, at least, it was for us just doing the work. What we did here was to take Shell statements that they've made and aspirations for powering progress and put some numbers behind it, because we wanted to understand what that would mean for absolute emissions. A climate transition strategy that increases emissions is a problem. It's a problem for our climate. It's a problem for investors. How much can one portfolio withstand of the remaining carbon budget? And is 8% for one stock too much? It's also a problem for Shell to allow them to thrive and add value for investors in a truly decarbonised world. Thank you so much for letting us share some of our findings today. For any investors interested, in understanding a little more, please get in touch.
Thanks, Ling. Some pretty, as you say, a lot to take in, and some pretty grim findings there, or challenging findings. I am going to throw to Simon, to Professor Lewis, to take us through the implications of this kind of strategy, particularly around nature-based solutions. Thank you, Simon.
Hi, everyone. So I just got a kind of update on nature-based solutions, as they're called, but I think it's better to call them nature-based contributions, because on their own, they're really not a solution. And They're a mixed bag of different things, which is where some of the confusion comes from. And you can think of them as being in three categories. Protecting ecosystems, so that is usually avoiding deforestation in the tropics. And that is usually measured as avoided emissions from some baseline. So this isn't carbon removal to neutralize any emissions from an activity. The second is managing working lands better. So that is timberlands, croplands, and livestock. So that's both a mix of avoided emissions and some carbon removal. So avoided emissions might be managing your soil better so it doesn't lose as much carbon, and removal might be planting some trees on farmland, or managing timber, harvesting so it's lower emissions. And then finally, you've got restoring ecosystems. So restoring a forest, planting trees, restoring a wetland that then removes carbon from the atmosphere. So there are these three categories. So if we look at Shell today, it's saying that it's avoiding 4.3 megatons of CO2 from avoided deforestation, and is currently not removing any carbon from the atmosphere from ecosystem restoration or planting trees. So currently it's actually removing none of its emissions into nature-based solutions. It's just paying for some avoided deforestation. And it's worth noting that the carbon credits associated with avoided deforestation are usually lack enough additionality. So the money that's paid for these credits changing behavior to reduce emissions is usually very low. So these credits are trading on the market around $3 to $5 a ton of CO2 and are not avoiding as much emissions as the credits say that you're buying. And if we look at Shell's future plans, it hopes to remove or use nature-based solutions for around 120 megatons of carbon dioxide a year by 2030. To get that in context, that is greater than the total global voluntary carbon market today of all countries and all companies. So that is an enormous scaling up. And if we think about that by area, that's approximately the equivalent of the UK as a new forest that continues to grow and suck carbon out of the atmosphere over the next 30 years or so. So roughly 24 million hectares. And that carbon must stay out of the atmosphere, essentially in perpetuity, if it's doing the carbon removals from adding the carbon to the atmosphere from the use of petroleum products. So that's not only a short-term problem, or a short-term question of scaling up the creation of ecosystems, it's also a question of protecting that carbon that's stored in those ecosystems, in those trees, in that soil, for the very long term. And that highlights how problematic it is to release geological carbon continually and hope that you can store it as biological carbon in ecosystems. There has to be some limits to that. And there's a very nice paper in Nature from last year from Cook Patton and a whole team looking at the global biophysical limits of how much land there is to do this nature-based solutions on, to do the ecosystem creation, and to avoid impacts of other climate impacts, such as changes in albedo, the reflectance, to avoid impacting food production, and to avoid big negative impacts on biodiversity. They estimate there's about 678 million hectares of land could be available. So at Shell's rate of use, that's around 4% of the land available, and this 120 megatons of CO2 is offsetting, is removing carbon associated with only perhaps around 7% of its total emissions in 2030, which shows that nature can make a contribution to removing carbon from the atmosphere, but it's modest in the context of companies that want to continue to add such enormous volumes of carbon into the atmosphere each year. And with that, I'll leave it there and pass on to the next speaker. And very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Again, some fairly grim conversations there. I think just taking into account the size in layman's terms of the area that needs to be protected in perpetuity is quite confronting. So I will hand over to Associate Professor Meinshausen, or Malte, who I think we're up for a bit of a galloping run through carbon budgets here. I understand there's a number of slides, so prepare to be dazzled.
Thank you very much. No, it's actually just a little bit of an offset scheme, 3 slides before, now 25 slides, but we're going to get through this. So I'm going to present you some slides, background on carbon budgets and the indices, where the world is heading, and overall where emissions have to go in order to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And these slides are all from either the IPCC report or the recently released UNFCCC synthesis report that came out 2 weeks ago. First, on one of the key messages from the IPCC, it is now an established fact that it's us humans who are causing climate change. Before, we always had probabilities, and it's likely, or very likely, extremely likely, we are the dominant source. Now IPCC made it very clear that time is over. It is an established fact. And also IPCC had that clear message that we are going to reach 1.5 degrees, but it's our choice whether we are going to shoot past it. And that's very important. In the lowest scenario, we are just bubbling around 1.5, and then by the end of the century, we can go again below it, but we are going to reach 1.5 degrees. So for adaptation strategies, we need to be prepared in that sense. Also, a key finding that was now underpinned by much more science is that we need to reach net zero emissions. Otherwise, we're not net zero carbon emissions. Otherwise, we're not going to hold global warming. So at any level that you want to limit global warming, whether it is at 1.5, at 2 degrees, even at 3 degrees, at some point, the CO2 emissions have to be net zero. There's no way around it. So let's just look at the 5 scenarios that this working group 1 report looked at. Here you see them in the lines, and the lowest one, the one that gets us to around 1.5 degrees, that is net zero CO2 by around 2050. Both the lower one scenarios really start their journey towards lower emissions this decade. This year is 2020. And these are the CO2 emissions. You see here, it's around 40 gigatons. And we just saw before that even on this graph of the global emissions, you would see Shell here with its 1.5 down here as the first tick. Now, what are the emission projections? This is a boring table, but these are the 5 scenarios. And see here in the top row, in the lowest scenarios, we are going to reach and slightly exceed even 1.5 by the middle of the century. But then by the end of the century, we are going to be back here at around 1.4 degrees. This is a much more beautiful representation of exactly the same thing, that ugly table or this graph. I'm slightly biased because I did it together with my colleagues. And so we used the Ed Hawkins warming stripes. Ed Hawkins was also a colleague in this first chapter. And so you see here all the temperature of the past and how we fare currently. And then under these 5 scenarios that we looked at here, the lowest one with net zero emissions around 2050, you're not going to go back to blue stripes. However, you're going to not end up in dark charcoal territory either. So of these 5 scenarios, it is really the one that peaks emissions now. This is here symbolized by that little arrow, halves global emissions around the 2030s, and then gets to net zero by around 2050. And then we are still in for a future with more wildfires, floods and droughts, but it could be much worse if we don't choose that pathway. On the remaining carbon budgets, this is kind of the key iconic figure of IPCC that looks at that concept. And what you see here on the bottom axis are the cumulative CO2 emissions since 1850. So here 1,000, 2,000, then 3,000 gigatons. So here, since the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published the first report that was around 1990s, we emitted around 2/3 of the then available carbon budget to 1.5 degrees. Now we have around 500 gigatons left. So here in gray, you see what we emitted in the past. And under these scenarios, you see what we are going to have available until 2050. And that's not much. That is around these 500 gigatons here. And you see here on the y-axis, the temperature evolution. So 1.5, we are relatively close to it. If we want to really stop warming at around 1.5, then we have to start reducing emissions now and get to net zero by 2050. This is the same thing basically in a table. Here, when you look at 1.5, with a 50% chance, we have around 500 gigatons of cumulative emissions left between now 2020 and then roughly around 2050. So 500 gigatons CO2 is the overall number that we can afford to emit. Otherwise, we're going to shoot beyond 1.5. If we shoot to higher cumulative emission numbers, then either we have the option of sucking the stuff out of this atmosphere again, or we are going to end up at higher temperature levels. Nevertheless, if we are going to overshoot that budget, we are going to face slight overshoot in temperature and also some additional climate impacts. Just to drive home the message, CO2 is really the dominant climate forcer and how we change the climate. There's lots of, you heard about methane, and there's a big initiative about methane reductions, etc. But it's really CO2 that makes up the dominant climate change by the end of the century. And this, if you look at these 5 scenarios again that we considered, you see here the total warming in that leftmost column. We see here in dark what we already have, the warming around 1.1, 1.2 degrees. And then the warming by the end of the century that is contributed by CO2 is here, that next big bar. Everything else, the non-CO2 greenhouse gases and aerosols and land use, they make these smaller bars here, either a little bit of extra warming or a little bit of extra cooling. But it's really CO2 that we get to have a handle on. And again, you see from the low to the very high scenarios. Luckily, and that is a big change, and that is a positive change since the last assessment report, with the dramatic shift in economics of renewable energies and the lower prices, and that they are now more competitive than fossil fuels in most areas of the world, or soon to be. The projections is not anymore that we're going to end up at this very high scenario unless the climate feedbacks are really adversarial to us. Unless we really take money in our hand and burn, we are going to end up more into this world here, which is still a dramatic warming of 2.5 or 3 degrees. But it really takes some extra effort to keep warming at 1.5 degrees. You see here again in blue of the overall forcing, how we warm the climate system, of the overall forcing compared to all other greenhouse gases. You see in blue the chunk that is made up by CO2, and then you have methane, nitrous oxide, etc. So yes, it's good to focus also on the other gases, and yes, we also have to reduce them. And yes, sometimes it's even hard to reduce them because some methane and some nitrous oxide sources are related to agricultural productivities and our food production, but it's really CO2 is the main driver. Just one thing to drive home here, why is it so important to stay at the lowest temperature level, and why we are still up for quite dramatic shifts in our climate system. You see here the 5 scenarios and the sea level rise. Here, by the end of the century, roughly between 50 centimeters and 1 meter of extra sea level rise. So the coasts that you have been playing on as a kid, they will look different by the end of the century. And here also a little bit scary that low likelihood but high impact scenario, that if the Antarctic ice sheet melts faster or disintegrates faster than previously anticipated, it could go even up to here the dashed line. However, this is 21st century. Now, look at this graph and the scale of it, and then look at this. This is then by 2300 on the same scale, the sea level rise that we are expecting in the lowest scenario or in the highest scenario. Now, just 2 more slides from the UNFCCC synthesis report. These are the scenarios that get us to lower 2 degrees. Again, you see here global greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis. And the 1.5 degree scenarios are here in brighter blue and turquoise. And this is where currently global country emissions are heading for by 2030. Again, this is the yellow middle scenario that I showed you before, around the 2.5 or 3 degree future. So there has to be a dramatic shift in overall countries' ambitions as well. However, multiple countries already put forward 2050 targets and net zero 2050 targets, and some of them also ambitious 2030 targets. So this subset of around 70 countries is pretty much on the right path, but overall as a world, we are not yet. And just to come back to the remaining carbon budgets, these are the remaining carbon budgets here for either a 50% chance to stay around 1.5 degree warming on the left side. On the right side, you see it for 2 degrees. And then what we are expecting by countries and their emissions up to 2030. And so the 1.5 degree budget is then almost reduced if we are not upping the ambition of the indices. And there's some hopeful signs, both from China and India and the new targets elsewhere, and all the trajectory have to go down in absolute terms. I thank you here. My affiliations are with Climate Resource and the University of Melbourne, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So, Malte, I'm so impressed. When I heard there were 25 slides, I was a little bit terrified, but that was certainly a gallop through, and I should always be kind to climate scientists for presenting things to us in charts. So thanks very much.